Welcome to Trench Diaries. Gold Beach. Part 3.
Out of the smoke behind the Sherman, another tank advanced on us. This was a Churchill of the type with the very short and wide caliber gun. This Churchill simply stormed up the roadway, bulldozing aside the Sherman, went through the burning fuel and drove straight up to us without slowing down. It was trailing burning gasoline, and although our 88 hit it on the turret front, the round deflected off and went into a nearby house, ripping a hole in the wall. This Churchill driver evidently was very furious, because he took the tank directly up to our bunker, literally just a couple of meters away from it, and aimed its gun at the area of the 88mm position, which was near me. I saw the big cannon in the turret fire, and with that the whole area of the 88 embrasure was demolished in many fragments of concrete and debris. I heard the explosion through the corridor of the bunker, and the amount of smoke blinded us briefly. My gunner continued firing tracer into the smoke, expending a whole belt of ammunition into the roadway area left and right. But there was another explosion, and it was evident that the Churchill was firing his rounds repeatedly into the damaged embrasure. I began to change the ammunition belt, and I heard the gunner curse. I looked up over the edge of the concrete slit, and I came face to face with an English soldier who was outside. He had run at us through the smoke, and he was covered in grey concrete dust, except for his eyes, I clearly recall, which were very bright blue and bloodshot. He was in a total rage, that was obvious. I could see it on his face that he had a total and absolute desire to kill us. He threw a hand grenade into our post, which bounced through the corridor and exploded there. My gunner was still fumbling with the machine gun belt. The Englishman then fired in through the slit with a submachine gun, the type they call the Sten. This soldier must have used a whole magazine, because my gunner was hit in a devastating way in the chest and head. I was crouching down on the platform and looking up. I saw the Sten gun punch holes in his chest and the bullets emerge from his back. The bullets ricocheted wildly around the concrete walls and several hit me, but their energy was spent and they deflected off my steel helmet and my boots, so I wasn't injured. I had no time to think at this point. Outside the slit there was an explosion. This probably was the British soldier either being hit by a shell or treading on a mine, I don't know which. Pieces of his tunic came flying in over the edge of the embrasure, burning and smoking. I left my gunner lying on the floor, as he was clearly dead. I ran out through the door and into the corridor. Here I saw that the whole bunker was being destroyed around us. The steps that led down to the 88mm gun posts was strewn with debris, and several of the 88 gunners were crawling upon them, badly injured. There were still explosions at the front of the bunker, probably from the Churchill or other tanks. The officer who had threatened me with a pistol earlier was there, and he gestured for me and another man who was running from the ammunition pit to follow him. I thought that he meant us to leave the bunker, but instead he directed us back into my MG room where I had just left. He went in first, and as soon as he entered there was more submachine gun fire and also a huge explosion. I saw a very bright light from inside the MG room and a flickering glow that subsided slowly. I looked into the MG room and the scene was terrible. The officer and my dead gunner were on fire, with their limbs burned away, and the room was full of a burning powder which coated the walls and was dripping from the ceiling. I was sickened by this sight. I believed the bunker was being overrun completely now, so together with the other soldier I exited the building through the steel door on the rear, holding my rifle. Outside the situation was confused. There were still many Allied aircraft overhead, with black and white stripe marks on their wings and fuselage. I saw no Luftwaffe aircraft at all. There were several of our troops firing with rifles and MP40 from the sunken path that went to the farmhouse, aiming at the front of the bunker. These were not riflemen though, but cooks and so on from the battalion staff, and they were being hit badly by return fire. I jumped down into the sunken path. I looked around at the bunker and saw the roof starting to sag and crack as the explosions kept striking it. One of the soldiers said, "The bunker is finished, we should surrender." He threw away his rifle and raised his hands, but he was immediately shot in the head and his skull fragmented while his arms were stretched out. Then, large numbers of English troops began to storm towards us from the bunker, with rifles and fixed bayonets. Our men shot down 2 of them, but the others kept charging, and they fell on us with their bayonets. There was a dreadful few seconds of hand-to-hand fighting. I saw one of the Englishmen stab a German through the stomach with his bayonet and throw him aside like a sack. then move on to the next German whom he stabbed in the neck. The soldier next to me clubbed this man over the head with his rifle butt, then stepped back and shot him in the chest. The Englishman slashed at the soldier even as he slumped down, blinding him in one eye with his bayonet. Another English soldier came up the slope with a Thompson gun and shot down many Germans before he himself was hit by MP40. Together with the partially blinded man, I moved down into the sunken path and ran along it away from the bunker. I am not sure what our plan was at this point, but the bunker was obviously a lost position. Behind us, I could hear terrible screams, which I think was the ongoing hand-to-hand fighting with the English using their bayonets. Some shots rang past us, but no English followed. We came up from the path at the farmhouse building and immediately were surrounded by a squad of our own German troops, with one officer demanding to know what the situation was on the beach. I reported that the British were inside the bunker and were bringing tanks up over the seawall and esplanade. Indeed, we could hear tank engines rattling and revving on the coastal side of the farmhouse. The officer and troops present were men I had not seen before, but from their corps colors I saw that they were from a Panzer Grenadier unit. They were armed with Panzerfaust rockets and had an MG42, some rifles and MP40, so they gave me a sense of safety, if such a thing was even possible. The troops also assured me that a 75mm pack was just behind them. It was only a matter of minutes, they said. The Panzer Grenadier officer then ordered us all to take up positions on the coastal side of the farmhouse, the house that we had used as a barracks. We took up posts along the low ridge, which had been built up as a defensive position with sandbags and barbed wire. It gave us a good view down the rolling slope all the way towards the defense line at the beach. It was covered with some dunes and grass. The slopes here were mined with anti-personnel and anti-tank mines in random patterns. I could see the bunker. It was now largely demolished and a lot of smoke was rising from it. We saw a Sherman tank emerge from over the mounds by the ruined bunker, and this was an astonishing sight for us all. This Sherman was fitted with a revolving drum on the front, held by two girders on which were tied a large number of heavy chains. The drum was revolving and the chains were crashing onto the earth with a deafening noise, raising clouds of dust and soil. I had never seen a machine like this, but the officer shouted that this was a mine-clearing vehicle, and indeed I saw several explosions under the chains as the tank came forward, these being mines that detonated. I was fascinated by its clever design, despite my apprehension. I could just see, behind the mine-clearing tank, two other Shermans, also with these revolving drums, following it on either side. The path they were clearing was thus about 20 meters wide. One of the Panzer Grenadiers fired a Panzerfaust, but the range was too great and the rocket fell to the ground without striking anything. The officer shouted for us to hold fire and said that the pack gun was coming up to defend the slopes. However, the English began to fire mortar rounds at us. These small bombs fell without warning and caused bursts of flame with a large amount of shrapnel as they exploded. Several of these mortar rounds hit the farmhouse behind us, knocking pieces off the roof, and then began to fall among us men on the ridge. A Panzer Grenadier a few meters from me was hit badly, and he lay quivering on the earth with blood shooting from his chest. The partially blinded soldier who came with me from the bunker was hit in the back and was unable to move any further. At this point, there was no medical attention available to these men at all. We had to leave them as they fell because we expected a full assault at any moment. I was sprayed with blood from the wounded Panzer Grenadier, and this added to my unease. Another soldier was hit by shrapnel in the head, and his skull was completely opened above one ear with his brain matter visible. I tell you all this because this was the experience that I had, and these were the things I saw. As the mine-clearing tanks came closer, the noise was incredible, and the pounding of the chains on the earth could be felt under us. Several times a chain came loose from the spinning drum after a mine explosion, and the chain flew up into the air a great distance and then came falling to the ground. One of these huge chains, which was about 3 meters long, fell in this way onto two of our men and knocked them both unconscious where they were crouching. One of their comrades leaped up and aimed his Panzerfaust over the ridge, and the weapon fired, sending a jet of flame back behind it. I looked over the ridge and saw the rocket strike the revolving chains, but the projectile was simply knocked up into the air and it flew away across the slope. However, other men were stationed at the extreme ends of the ridge and they were able to fire on the sides of this leading Sherman. The angle was acute and thus not ideal, but they aimed well, pointing the warheads at the wheels and tracks along the sides, and they saw the tank hit in its running gear. There was a large orange flash and suddenly the chain drum slowed and then stopped revolving. The tank itself stopped completely and smoke began to pour from the rear decks. our other men did not need a second chance, and they aimed a Panzerfaust directly onto the Sherman's front now that the chains were immobile. The rocket struck the lower turret, which was turned to the rear, and blew a hole in it which disgorged sparks. We thought that we had stopped this tank, but the machine gun in its front plate fired on us, shooting all the way along the ridge and blowing out puffs of earth wherever the bullets hit. Also, the two similar tanks behind it came level and continued to advance even though the leading tank was now burning. I saw pieces of metal and debris shooting up from the back of the burning tank as the engine burned up fiercely. The front hull hatch opened and the crewman emerged. The Panzergrenadier MG42 team immediately shot him. Again, I had the sensation that we would pay dearly for doing such things to these people. By this time, we had about a dozen able-bodied troops left on this ridge, including myself and the officer. We had no Panzerfausts left, but finally the pack gun arrived, towed behind a Hanomag armored half-track. This was a large 75mm pack gun, and the crew flew into action like devils, hauling it around and positioning it on one side of the ridge where it could fire down the slopes. The Hanomag had an MG in the shielded mount too, so we now had considerably more firepower. The pack crew began firing within 60 seconds. I was astonished at their speed. They immediately hit one of the two mine-clearing Shermans, striking it on the revolving drum. The drum separated from the vehicle and crashed off into the ground while still revolving at high speed. This great metal cylinder raced off among the dunes in a comical way, sending out bits of chain and debris that flew long distances on both our side and the English side. The tank was undamaged though, and it halted and began to traverse its turret towards us. Our pack fired again, but the round deflected off the angled front plate and went off to one side. The pack fired another shot, and this one struck the Sherman in the tracks, causing the drive gear to break off and spin away. However, although this tank was now immobile, its turret was fully rotated onto us and it fired on the pack using high explosive. The shot went wide, but the blast lifted the gun up and rocked it, so the crew had to readjust. They struggled greatly to operate it and worked like devils with their hands, but in the end, nothing came of it. The Sherman fired again, and this round hit the pack crew directly. This was a dreadful sight, because much of the 75mm ammunition exploded and the debris was blasted out all around us. I am sorry to say that this was debris of the gun, its barrel, but also debris of the crew. Their limbs, clothing, boots, water bottles, everything they had with them. Everything was torn apart in front of us.